Welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/follow. Today in the show, we have Tanja Dowe. She is a healthcare executive, and her Kevin MD article is titled "The Promise of In-Silico Drug Development to Improve Patient Outcomes." Tanja, welcome to the show.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you for having me.
We'll get into your article in a little bit. First off, briefly share your story and journey to where you are today.
So I grew up in Finland, which is one of the leaders in sort of digitalization of different industries, whether it be consumer industries or healthcare industries. My father was a cardiothoracic surgeon, was very passionate about his profession, and often over dinner tables, we would listen to his stories about his surgeries and his day at the hospital and medicine. And I grew interested in healthcare and how could I contribute to help patients. I went to University of Technology to study microbiology and biochemical engineering. And right after graduating, I started my first company doing market research in biotech industry. After that, I had a career in transaction and strategy consulting in life sciences, again, trying to bring innovative new diagnostics or medical devices or treatments to patients. 6 years ago, I joined a company in Switzerland developing oncology drugs, and I'm leading their fund investing in digital health startup companies.
So when it comes to that intersection between technology and healthcare, one of those technologies is in silico drug development. You talk about that and how that could improve patient outcomes. Now, before talking about your piece, tell us what in silico drug development is.
Right. So as you can imagine, before an airplane goes up in the air, the engineers will always do simulation on a computer screen. They will build sort of technical models and simulate how the airplane will perform in the air. Now, in health and in pharmaceutical development in the past, it's a very biological process. We're developing drugs, we're doing a lot of lab tests, we test in animals, and then we go to human trials. But we haven't traditionally really simulated how drugs work on a computer screen. And so in silico drug development, the way I see it, is really about building those disease models, building sort of digital humans, and being able to simulate how drugs or treatments work in patients before we go to patients, so that we can predict the efficacy or toxicities and make sure that we only bring the best drugs that will most likely work into the human trials.
So talk more about that in your Kevin MD article. So tell us what the benefits of those are.
Yeah, so as I said, you can earlier in the drug development really see whether the treatment shows promise of efficacy, whether there seem to be toxicities based on complex molecular interactions. Another thing is that if we could reduce the amount of animal testing, it's wonderful for the moral and ethical perspective of saving animal lives. But at the same time, 90% of drugs, or more than 90% of drugs that are tested in animals, fail to pass human trials. And if we build these models, we base them on human data. So human data-based models will predict much better the performance of the drug. So this is one thing. There's also, as you know, in clinical trials, you have the treatment arm and you have a control arm. Now, it adds to the length of the drug development process and the cost when you have to have two groups, and one group getting potentially a very promising drug and one staying on the standard of care or another treatment. Now, in these type of synthetic or in silico clinical trials, you may be able to reduce the amount of patients required for the control arms. So again, this is something that will help bring better drugs to patients faster and maybe have a positive contribution to, the cost problem of healthcare.
So when it comes to building those models where you can do some of this early stage drug testing, tell us what goes into creating those computer models.
So a lot of biological science. You have to understand interactions. You have to do a lot of research you have to bring all the science from articles, from common knowledge, potentially from your own proprietary databases. You need to bring data. You bring knowledge onto a platform. You use usually something called mechanistic modeling. It's a very mathematical concept, mechanistic modeling of how those interactions work. Today, we use a lot of AI to build those models. So build that model, and it's basically a picture of how the disease, how different parts of the disease or the interactions between molecules, how they lead to a certain trigger or of a symptom. And if you bring a drug, you also model that drug compound, and you show how, or you see on the screen how it interacts with those molecular interactions. And based on that, you can simulate humans and diseases in a very, very computational way.
So how common are we using it?
We are, again, in the beginning of it, because I invest in innovative startups trying to solve big problems. Usually the field that I work in and the kind of stories that I write, the articles that I write, is about very early innovation. But it is increasing because today's also the pharmaceutical industry is in trouble because it's not sustainable to bring high cost drugs to market. We need to be able to squeeze the timeline, squeeze the costs. And it is, I would say that majority of the pharmaceutical companies are at the moment experimenting, using these technologies, maybe side by side, the old methods, but we have seen already signs that these models work, and they can accelerate the development timelines, as well as the FDA, or in Europe the EMA, the regulators have started to acknowledge these methods and are developing ways so that they can also evaluate drugs that have been developed using some of these computational methods. So it is up and coming.
Now, are there any particular type of drugs that would benefit from this type of technology when it comes to doing trials?
I would say that orphan diseases is, of course, one, because it's usually for orphan diseases, it's difficult to find enough patient populations to test very different parameters in the patients. So to be able to test different characteristics of patients and try to ensure the safety, this is one clear advantage. Another one is cancer. We are today going into deeper and deeper into the cancer, the molecular composition of cancer. We're doing genetic testing to see what is the reason behind certain cancers, what's the mutation. So we are going to more mutation-specific treatments. Again, when we go from sort of general cancer or certain type of cancer into the mutation-specific cancers, the patient population is smaller, and we need to make sure that some of these drugs that we're developing might work really well for certain type of cancers or certain mutations and not the others. And we might not be able to bring them to the market, to the patients, if we cannot test them in the right patient populations.
So as this technology matures, what do you see as a realistic pathway going forward?
I would say that we should be able to reduce the timelines 2 to 3 years. So and bring the cost down of the drug development, have the drugs faster in the patient hands. It will take, I would say, it always takes longer than you expect. So, 5 years to get this more accepted, adopted. Maybe in 10 years, we start seeing the benefit of drugs that are entering to the market to patients that are well targeted to the right patient population.
We're talking to Tanja Dowe. She is a healthcare executive. Her Kevin MD article is titled "The Promise of In-Silico Drug Development to Improve Patient Outcomes." Tanja, you're involved with a whole host of health technology startups. What other exciting healthcare technologies do we have to look forward to in the coming years?
Right. So I as I mentioned, I really like to be passionate about the big problems of healthcare and try to bring my contribution to solve them, whether it is cost, whether it is the workload on clinicians, on doctors and nurses, on having less hands available and having aging population with more and more severe diseases as we live longer. So whether we can bring AI more to support diagnosing, maybe earlier diagnosis of certain diseases, predicting the patient path, where the patient is going, how quickly is the disease going to progress. Maybe we can help prevent some of these diseases. Also, another aspect that I'm really excited about is bringing tools to patients for them to take care of themselves. So whether it is giving access to data, giving access to healthcare from remote places, or having just tools to help understand your symptoms, manage your symptoms. And remember, when you go to the doctor's office and you hear about a diagnosis and he tells you what you should do, a big part of that conversation goes by because you're maybe in shock or you're worried. You go home, you have maybe some papers, but if you have an app that helps you with questions, if you have certain symptoms, it gives you advice. So this type of help for patients, I believe, is important and can really help with reducing the workload on healthcare professionals, giving the keys of their own health to the patients.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
Right. So I think that AI and computational methods and digital health sounds very technical, but I really think that these engineering sciences are coming closer together with the biological sciences, and they can add value, but we need to work together. So we need to stay open to each other, listen to the engineering side, listen to the medical side, and remember that we have a common goal, which is to improve patient outcomes.
Tanja, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. Thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Kevin.